So, with news today that essentially the European Parliament and their countries have essentially unanimously approved the Brexit deal. Now, why on earth would apparently, according to the Guido Fawkes blog, if this amazing deal that we have signed is apparently massively in favour of us and not in favour of the EU, why have they all unanimously passed it? Well, because, quite frankly, it's just not the case. The deal overwhelmingly favours pretty much everything the EU wanted and has made us essentially a dog on a leash, which is exactly what the Brexiteers have been crying about for years. Now, to me, that's not really a problem because, once again, the Brexiteers' promises about Brexit being amazing and it's going to be good from the get-go all have to now start paying dividends from the 1st of January next year. There is no escape from their lies anymore. And sooner or later, the question will come up very quickly, was this worth it? And as we've repeated many times before, when you talk to people about Brexit and with the way that they voted, they wanted to make their lives better. And in no way does this make their lives better. Why? Because many of the people, especially who we're going to be talking about today, mainly in the Conservative Party, would unanimously blame Brussels. And of course, it brings back that old phrase that you may have heard me say before, but we, and especially the Tories, Europeanised failure but nationalised success. So anything that the European Union did, which was actually quite successful, they would say, oh, it wasn't the EU that did that, that was us. But any failure, oh no, that's not our fault, that's the EU's fault. And hence, the seeds of Brexit were planted, but many have been planted by essentially the elite of our country who take overwhelmingly, shall we say, pride of place position when it comes to really running it. And we have to really ask ourselves, why are we continuing to let these people run our country when so often they have led it to continuous disaster after catastrophe after yet more disasters? So that is what the article that we're going to be covering today. But before we do that, please do hit that like and share button. And of course, down below, there's a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link. And thank you very much to all those who do support me that way. So, on with the article then. So this comes from The Guardian. Its title is, Throughout History, Britain's ruling class has created crisis after crisis, just like now. When the novelist John le Carre died earlier this month, among the passages quoted by journalists was the short excerpt from The Secret Pilgrim, published in 1990. In the book, the words are spoken by le Carre's fondly loved character, Georgie Smith. And it said, quote, "The privately educated Englishman and Englishwoman, if you will allow me, is the greatest dissembler on earth. He says, was, is now, and shall ever be, as for long as our disgraceful school system remains intact. Nobly will charm you, so glibly, disguise his feelings from you so better, cover his tracks more skilfully, or find it harder to confess to you that he has been a damned fool." The words are a cutting summary of the far-off era of the upper-class treachery and Cold War suffrage, but also fit the less romantic time of Brexit, the pandemic, and a Conservative Party whose leadership is led by two public schoolboys has pushed us into disaster. Therein lies a huge part of the national tragedy, that amid stranded lorries and shamefully high death toll and some of the greatest peacetime blunders of this country has ever made, has recently seemed to be reaching for some kind of awful climax of late. Some of the best writing about the mess were all focused on Boris Johnson's character flaws, which are undoubtedly a big part of the tale. But what has been rather less examined is the fact that this shortcomings blur into a much longer story about our long-standing ruling class and its habit of creating crisis after crisis. In the year 2021, it will mark the 80th anniversaries of George Orwell's inspirational essay, The Lion and the Unicorn. His warmly patriotic text about the English national character and his brief that this country's efforts in the early stages of the Second World War were being compromised by the fact that he was still resident in the quote the most class-ridden country under the sun. Here too, there are plenty of characterizations of the English elite that seem pertinent now as they were then. Probably the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, but the opening battles of all subsequent wars have been lost there, wrote Orwell. As an Etonian himself, he surely knows what he was talking about. And of the ruling class of politicians who have overseen Britain's domestic travels during the 1920s and 30s, were pursuing the dangerous foreign policies that culminated in appeasement, he said this: "What is to be expected of them is not treachery or physical cowardice, but stupidity, unconscious sabotage, an infallible instinct for doing the wrong thing. They are not wicked, not altogether wicked, but they are merely unteachable." Back when Conservatives last partly understood such criticism and successfully embraced first post-war consensus politics, then the populist meritocracy most spectacularly embodied by Margaret Thatcher, they were harder to malign as characters and stuffed shirts. But in the build-up to Christmas, I watched Johnson deny the nightmare of a no-deal Brexit, row back on his stupid promise of a normal Christmas, and then yet again offer the prospect of a return to normality, by this time to be suggested by Easter. Orwell's words were once again made perfect sense. Since the election as party leader of David Cameron back in 2005, even if the Conservative had struck with a post-World Thatcher view of the world, many of the inner circle of the Tory politics have reverted to a way of doing things more rooted on grouse moors of the old than in the modern world. Johnson's arrival at the top received a familiar mix of entitlement, superficiality, and lives that most people would think impossibly opulent. We all know what those things have led to. A seemingly endless run of terrible decisions, from the calling of the 2016 referendum to the chain of stupidities that has defined Britain's experience of COVID-19. And just to be clear, the downsides of a certain kind of privileged leadership have flared up on all sides of politics, from the messianic arrogance that led Tony Blair into the Iraq disaster, to Nick Clegg's virtual destruction of the Liberal Democrats. But in the main, this is a Tory story. If your Christmas presents included the horrifically redeemable memoir of the Diary of an MP's Wife by Sarah Swire, whose husband Hugo was a minister under Cameron and part of his social circle, you will have a sense of what all this looks like up close. Johnson's biographer, Sonia Puller, describes Swellow's book as a portrait of people who are unconscious, entitled, snobbish, incourteous, and callously childish, and obsessed with the subtle distractions of taste and status that separate the middle from the upper class, and drawn into politics and power not out of a sense of mission or duty, but a dull belief that things are to what these people them do. Under Johnson, the same culture of entitlement and mutual back-scratching has hardened into a so-called chumocracy. Oligarchy is rarely an efficient or sensible way to govern, but that doesn't seem to have gotten that way. Just before Christmas, dismay about Johnson and his government and its apparent distance from reality seemed to be reaching its peak. But then came the Brexit trade deal, and a familiar idea returned, not at least in the right-wing press, that under this shambolic exterior the Prime Minister is some kind of swashbuckling genius, this archetype that grabs onto a glim charm cited by Leclerc and draws deep on a well of deference. The reality is surely that this reckless project, driven by alumni of private schools, Johnson, Dominic Cummings, Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, etc., has all resulted in probably the only trade deal in history that puts up barriers to commerce rather than removing them. And it will be rushed through Parliament with a sickening disdain for any scrutiny. Combined with the economic efforts of the pandemic, the result will be a damage and uncertainty that is not only just starting. All the talk about Brexit now being finished is further proof of the ditch we have been led into. The disasters then will continue to mount up, but will it result in any change? If history teaches anything, it is that a country's mixture of cap-doffing and unsaleable privilege tends to tends to keep even the most rotten hierarchies in place, and the saga grinds on. This is the essence of the very British mess that we seem unable to escape. And that is true. We are in an absolutely god-awful mess. And he's absolutely right. That is the only trade deal in history to put up barriers to trade, not to remove them. And as we've said on this channel before, certainly not this government will go back to the European Union to try and improve that trade deal. No, this government will do everything it can possibly to try and prove that Brexit is a success, no matter how nebulous. And trust me, I fully expect them to start lying. Definitely next year, because they are going to find it incredibly hard to try and justify any success of Brexit whatsoever, especially with the current trade deal. And that's just the unfortunate fact, and we need to try and escape this fact. And it will be up to probably a future Labour government to go back to the European Union and start to rebuild these bridges. And that question will be, do we rejoin the European Union? Undoubtedly, that will be a yes. And as I've often said to a lot of people, this will probably happen a lot quicker than I think a lot of people think it will. So, with that said, thanks for watching as always, and please do remember to hit that like and share button, and of course down below there is a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link. And thank you very much to the people that do support me that way, and we'll see you next time.